Hey everyone, I'm Brian Parks, and in this video I want to talk about PHP. Specifically, I've titled this video PHP, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And what I mean by that is that I think PHP is fantastic. I really think it's a great programming language and environment for a lot of web developers, but at the same time, it does have its pitfalls, and that's what I want to talk about in this video. So I have a few notes on my phone here, and I want to just go through them. So first off, what I'm talking about is not syntax, right? Syntax is what it is, but at the end of the day, different languages have different syntaxes, and that doesn't necessarily make them good or bad. They're just different, and some people might not like the $ in PHP. Does that make it a bad language? I don't think so. It's just different syntax. So I'm not going to talk about syntax here. What I mean by good is that there are lots of things about PHP that are either even really great, really amazing, but at least neutral or better. When I talk about bad, what I'm talking about is things that I don't think are really neutral. Maybe they're a little bit negative, but they can be used well. There are ways to use them in good ways, or there are workarounds. They're not, they're not necessarily a black mark against PHP. They're just not the greatest thing in the world. When I talk about ugly, what I mean by that is things that are just downright bad, but you can't get away from them. You can't escape from them when you're using PHP. They are a fact of life. They're something you just have to deal with. In some cases, they're the only way to do certain things, and you just have to kind of accept that and be careful with how you use it, because there's no alternative. So to start off with, let's talk about what I think is good about PHP. I really like that PHP is cross-platform. It has good support from editors like Visual Studio Code, and that's what I'll be using in the demo portion in just a second. It's very flexible, and it's very easy for people who haven't done a lot of programming to get into PHP and do something very reasonable. You don't have to follow a bunch of rules, learn a bunch of rules right up front in order to start being productive in PHP, and in that way it's fantastic. It can be used both as a programming language and as a templating language. So you can do things like, if statements, while loops, that sort of thing, or you can switch into more of a markup sort of mode and intersperse, echo statements and even logic, ifs and loops and that sort of thing, using you can follow if in a condition with a colon. And then when you're done with that particular block of markup, you have a PHP statement that says end if, and then it's kind of a little more declarative rather than kind of the imperative programmatic stuff that we're used to. Composer, PHP's package manager, is fantastic. I can't say enough good things about Composer. I think it's probably the best package manager out there. NPM is getting closer, but back in the days when I started using Composer, which was about 5 years ago, NPM was still non-deterministic. So you could have two developers run npm install on the exact same code base with the exact same version constraints and get two different versions of packages potentially, which I don't know about you, but that doesn't give me a warm and fuzzy feeling. Composer always had a lock file, or at least as long as I've been using it. So you always were guaranteed that two developers would Composer install and get the exact same set of packages and versions, no matter when they did it, where in the world they did it, what new versions of packages were out, that sort of thing. They were always guaranteed to get the same versions, which does give me the warm and fuzzies. And then especially recently, PHP has had a really vibrant community. A lot of different people from a lot of different industries, walks of life, which is fantastic, getting those different perspectives. But even more recently, the renewed vision in making PHP a really competitive web application language. I think there are a lot of good things that have come out of the PHP community, especially over the past 5 years, and I'm really excited to see where it goes in the next 5, 10, 15 years. So I think that's a strength of PHP. But now let's get into some of the bad things in PHP, in my opinion. So right off the bat, we have to talk about printing to output. And let's start with echo. Right, that's probably the first one everyone learns. There's also another version, print. And as the IntelliSense told me, it takes a string of the thing to print. Then there's also print R, which, as you can see, takes a mixed. And basically, this prints, whatever. So let's just do something like post, which we'll actually come back to in a minute. And then there's also var dump, which dumps whatever you pass it to the screen. Now, the reason I think these are in the bad category is because there are 4 different ways to do it. They do slightly different things, but there are 4 different ways to do essentially the same thing. But also, they go directly to whatever the current standard output is, or the current output is. And that could be the console if you're running it at the console. That could be the response body if you're in a web context. That could still be the console if you're in a web context. You don't really know. Typically it's the response body if you're in a web context, but it is kind of this direct. From anywhere in the code, you can print directly to output. And it's not unique to PHP, but I think this is bad in any language because it does mean that whatever code you're writing, the functional programming language people are going to say this makes for non-pure code, basically code that has side effects. But I think the way it's used in PHP lends itself to a lot of extraneous printing in places that it doesn't really make sense to be printing from, maybe. There are ways around this, so you can do something called obstart, which is something called output buffering. And basically what this does is when you call this function, PHP starts buffering everything that you echo, print, printar, var dump after that point into an in-memory buffer. And then later on down the road, you can do, I think it's ob and clean. And what that does is you can stick it in a variable, say result, and then you can echo that. The biggest thing that this impacts is that if you're going through your response writing subroutine, be it from a template, be it just a bunch of PHP, if you hit a situation where you throw an exception, or some of the code you're running throws an exception, you don't get a partial response and then the exception information and then nothing else, right? We've all seen that on websites, obviously running PHP, and it just looks ugly. It doesn't create a great experience, and it's really nice if you can batch up building that response body, that response payload, be it HTML, JSON, whatever, and then only send it down to the browser when you know that it's complete. And that provides a much better user experience. If you're building an API, that means you're not going to send bad JSON down to an API client. And it also means that you can catch that exception, or ideally, if you're catching that exception, you can send a completely different response. You don't have to worry about what came before. You just throw away the response that you were building and send a different response down to the client, down to the browser, whatever. The downside to this is that it does go in memory, and this is, again, probably not unique to PHP, but it does mean that if you're doing a lot of processing, and especially a lot of writing to the screen, that's going to all go into memory. This means that if you're doing something like returning from an API, you can't stream things down to the client because you have to write all of this to the output buffer and then all at once batch that down to the client. So there are some downsides there. There are certainly ways to work around that, but by itself, it definitely goes into the bad category. The next thing I want to talk about that I would consider bad in PHP is what are called magic functions. And I think the PHP documentation calls them magic functions as well. Basically what we have there is, let's say we have a class, and then you can define a function called __ get, and another one called __ set. And there are other functions that fall into the same category. There's one to basically call a method that doesn't exist. The reason this is bad is because it does allow other code that's using this class to access properties or fields or call methods, in the case of the method calling one, that don't exist, and they may or may not get something reasonable, right? If you throw an exception here, maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. If you call a method that legitimately doesn't and, depending on your context, shouldn't exist, there should also be some corresponding functionality that happens. Either you throw an exception or you get a very clear indication that the user of this class called a method or accessed a field that did not exist. So this can lead to a lot of kind of unexpected functionality if you don't take care for how you implement these things. However, this can be a good thing. This is used in a lot of ORMs, object relational mappers, to kind of build a virtual class based on, say, the fields in a database table. So then you get an object back that represents a database record, and rather than having to create a class with a specific shape, or in your code defining a class that has all the same fields as your database has columns in that table, you can just write code that says, get the value of this field, and if that field exists in the table, you'll get a value back. If that field does not exist in the table, maybe you'll get an exception. Maybe you'll get an empty value. It's up to the definition of the ORM, how the ORM works. But that's a situation where something like this does, and the flexibility of PHP does lend itself to popular programming paradigms and things that, we can probably argue about the value of ORMs and the value of particular implementations of ORMs, but that's something where this functionality actually becomes useful and probably crosses over into good territory. So the feature itself, I'd say, is bad, or at least dangerous, but some uses of it can transition over into good territory. Up next, in the bad category, we have the ability to mix programming and templating into a single file. So here I have just classes, I have PHP, well actually this stuff would probably fall into the templating category, but if I just define a class in a PHP file, that's totally fine. I have the starting PHP tag, and then I don't have a closing PHP tag. And that is actually recommended by a lot of style guides, and I think possibly the official PHP style guide. However, if I then did this and then put some HTML in there, that is specifically discouraged by the PHP style guides. The recommended way to write PHP is you either have classes or more programmatic style code, function definitions, that sort of thing, in a file, or you have HTML markup, maybe with some PHP directives interspersed. So something like this would be okay in one of the more template style files. Something like, if some condition would be fine, because here you're basically using it as a templating language and doing conditional templating. So if this condition is true, we'll show this piece of HTML. Otherwise, we might show a different piece of HTML, or we might just leave it out entirely. But we wouldn't then follow it up with a class definition and maybe a bunch of business logic. We'd want to parcel that out into its own file, separate from the templating. And that separation of concerns is kind of a more general recommendation for all of software development. You don't want to have view logic and business logic and even database logic all crammed into the same file. That makes for unmaintainable code and in some cases unreadable code. So it's really not a stretch to imagine that having classes in one file or in one set of files and then having your view logic, your templates in a separate location is a good way to go. But if you combine them together, which PHP, the language, doesn't prevent you from doing that, I'd say that's definitely squarely in the bad category. Now let's talk about things that are ugly in PHP. And no discussion of PHP and what is ugly in PHP would be complete without talking about include, require once. So let's start with include. Include is far and away the ugliest thing PHP has, because not only does it include a specific file and tell the runtime where to get that file, which creates very high coupling between these two files, which is bad. We want to avoid coupling, strong coupling as much as possible. We want to have loose coupling as much as we possibly can. Include doesn't break when the include fails. However, it does write some output. So bad on multiple counts there. We'll just call it ugly and leave it at that. Require is slightly better, because even though it does still write that error message to the output, it at least stops processing of the script. Require is basically saying, I need this file or I cannot continue, which even when we're using include, isn't that usually what we want? I need this file or else I can't continue. Okay, require once is slightly better still has the potential to write an error to output, but it only requires the file, as the name implies, once. So this means that if you're requiring a file that contains a class definition or a function definition, you won't get multiple copies of that if the require once line is called multiple times while your script is executing. Because multiple class definitions with the same name, multiple function definitions with the same name, that's bad. These are, I guess, slightly better than include, but they are still in the ugly category because they create that strong coupling between the file running require once and the file that it's requiring. Now, we can reduce that coupling a little bit by a feature called auto-loading. And there is documentation for this. I'll leave a link to the official PHP docs for how to do auto-loading in the description below. And this it doesn't solve all the problems, because it does typically call one of these directives in your auto-loading handler, but it does mean that you can, say, mock out a particular implementation. Basically what it does is, let's say you have class my other class, and it extends superclass. if superclass isn't known to the runtime, it will try to call these auto-loading handlers. And as soon as it exists in the runtime, as soon as the runtime knows about it, it'll stop trying to auto-load it. Which means that if it's already been loaded, the runtime won't call any of the auto-loading handlers. The offshoot of this is that when you're testing, if you want to mock out superclass, and this is probably a bad example because I don't know why you'd mock out a superclass of a class you're defining. That doesn't really make sense. But if you're trying to use a class, you can mock it out, create that implementation, include it in your test code, and then whatever class is trying to use that, whatever functionality is trying to use that, won't go call the autoloader and try to load your concrete implementation of that class. It'll load your mock or something like that. So that's a little bit better. It does still have a little bit of magic going on behind the scenes. It does still call some of these other ugly constructs in PHP. So for that reason, I keep it in the ugly category. What else do we have? Yeah. The last thing that we'll talk about, actually two different things here. And I said this would be coming up later. This is firmly in the ugly category. And the reason for that is because this is something called a superglobal. Lots of people have talked about, especially over the past 10 years or so, global state is bad and why global state is bad. These superglobals, in the very name, they imply global state. And they are based on the request. So it's based on whatever's coming in the request body. So in this case, the post parameters. There's also a cookies variety. There's a get variety for get parameters. There's request, which has all three of them. There's the server array. There are a bunch of different things that are just kind of globally there, and you can always get to them no matter where you are in PHP. Which means that even if you're using a framework like Laravel, I think falls into this category, that provides, say, your controller action, an object that kind of nicely packages these things up and gives you access to them in more of a safe way, there's nothing stopping you from going directly to the superglobals and getting those values, which does lead to, again, tightly coupling code, a more difficult ability to test, and there's really no way to get around these things. Yes, you can avoid using them, but I put them firmly in the ugly category because they are still there. You can't escape the fact that they still exist. And in addition to that, what happens if you want to access JSON from the body? Well, these variables, post and request, only work with form encoded requests. But JSON it's just another encoding of more or less structured information. So why can't I just use _post to get access to these things as well? Well, in order to do that, in order to get access to a JSON request body, there's this special file named PHP input. And I'm pretty sure I have that right. It's been a while since I actually did this. A lot of times I just write handler or helpers to do this for me because I end up doing it so often, especially when I'm writing an API. This dumps the input, or you can use that file name just like any other file, open it just like any other file, and then you can read from it. You can read all of its contents into an array, a string, a variable, and then parse it into an object, parse it as JSON into an object. Totally fine. That could even be XML, right? The _post variable only handles form data. So any other format, you need to go straight to php://input and get that kind of that raw string and then do whatever you need to it. Which, let's be honest, that's kind of ugly. Now, there are frameworks that kind of make that easier, but the fact of the matter is that it feels clunky. It feels like a web framework should really have first-class support for requests in any sort of format, or even be able to specify the format that the request is coming in as, or have the option to accept JSON or XML or form encoded input. All of those different things. So I think that's kind of ugly. I think that could probably be done a little bit better, but at least as of right now, there is no way around that. So with that, I think I've gotten to the end of my list. Yeah, so I'm sure I've missed something, but that's, I don't want this video to turn into hours long, so we'll leave it at that. Lots of good things about PHP. Again, I don't want this to detract from how powerful PHP is as a language and how valuable it is to the programming community. Lots of people use PHP as their very first language. It's very accessible to people, but it does, as with any language, it has its pitfalls. And as you get more into intermediate territory, I think it's valuable to know what these pitfalls are and know how to either work around them or know how to avoid falling into the traps that they set. So hopefully this was helpful to you. If you have ideas of other things that you would have put on the good, bad, and ugly lists, go ahead and leave a comment down below. And of course, like this video if you found it helpful. Share this video with friends, colleagues, anyone who's getting into PHP at a slightly more intermediate level. I think this is a little bit too much for someone who's just learning PHP. But once you've gotten your feet wet with PHP and you want to take it a little bit further without falling into some of the pitfalls that might be set for you, hopefully some of the things I talked about here are things that you'll find useful. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to check out my other PHP videos, especially my PHP in Windows Subsystem for Linux videos. I have a couple different playlists that I'll leave down in the description below. One specifically on PHP and one specifically on Windows Subsystem for Linux. There is some overlap between the two because I do a lot of PHP in Windows Subsystem for Linux. I think that's a great way to develop PHP on Windows. And check out those videos, and I would be happy to tell you why I think that's the case. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.